When we talk about AI ethics, we're typically talking about a certain set of AI ethics values or principles. So, for instance, we're talking about autonomy. And a lot of people think that those values that we articulate are often primarily Western values. So, in other places, autonomy might not be a prized ethical value, maybe to some degree, but something like the value of community might, in many cases, trump the value of individual autonomy. So this is the kind of issue that my guest today talks about. His name is Rockwell, or Rocky Clancy. He's a research scientist in the Department of Engineering Education at Virginia Tech, and he thinks that current AI policy, whether we're talking about government policy or the policy of a company, is created in a vacuum right now, in a kind of cultural vacuum that doesn't pay sufficient attention to cultural and psychological differences across the various kinds of populations that they impact. The risk, he thinks, is that number one, you might just wind up with AI that's ineffective. And number two, and worse, of course, it could be outright harmful insofar as it inculcates or promotes or expresses certain values that are not commensurate with the values of the people that it's impacting. His view is not really that, hey, here's how we should develop AI, but rather we need to do more empirical investigation into how different cultures, different countries manifest different values, for instance, different ways of thinking about fairness. And then that needs to inform, whatever those empirical findings turn out to be, needs to inform the content of our AI policy. Okay, so that's what this episode is about. If you've got any comments, criticisms, suggestions for guests, please email me at em@reedblackman.com. I have a book coming out in April called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. If you want to hear more about that book launch events, webinars, when the book is going to come out, chapters of that book in advance of the book coming out, please go to reedblackman.substack.com, subscribe there, and you'll get some updates. Okay, let's go talk to Rocky. Rocky, from what I gather, you think that AI policy, or policies about AI, are getting created in something of a vacuum because the policymakers are insufficiently sensitive to the cultural and psychological differences across the populations that their regulations are going to have an impact on. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's basically the idea. So our central claim is that to craft effective AI ethics policies, it's necessary to understand how the people who are affected by those policies and the people who are responsible for carrying out those policies, how those people think about and behave regarding AI and ethics. And so the way a lot of the policy gets made right now is just, we should do this, that, and the other thing, or we shouldn't do this or something else. And it's taking place in absence of any information about the people who are affected by that policy, the ones who are responsible for carrying it out. So the analogy is something like trying to tell someone how to fix a toilet without having any idea how plumbing works or how people use a toilet or something like that. Or imagine trying to teach calculus to a student who doesn't, if you don't know anything about how people learn, or you don't know what that person already knows about math. It would just be an impossible endeavor. That would be the claim.
Yeah, okay, so two things. I wonder if those analogies are the right ones. I guess you would know better than I, but if the central claim is something like policymakers are not paying sufficient attention to the cultural and psychological differences of people, then I'd want to hear about how a failure to understand the differences of cultures or psychologies leads them to create the wrong kinds of policies. The toilet stuff is more like, if you don't have technical expertise, then you're not going to be able to regulate that piece of technical equipment. That's fair enough. But I take it that your thesis is not about technical expertise, but something like, look, you might know how AI works perfectly well. You might be a brilliant data scientist, but if you don't understand something about the psychologies and cultures of the people that you're having an impact on, that's going to lead to certain kinds of problems.
No, and I think that's absolutely true also. So certainly we need the technical expertise, and even on that score, so much of the policy, so people talk about using AI, but they're not talking about how you're using AI, in which situations, why you would be using it. And so that's on the technical side, but then there's also this dimension of the people who are using that for what purposes. And one example that comes up a lot in higher education is how we do or don't use and integrate AI into teaching and things like this, and also K through 12, right? And I guess two examples of that have come up recently. So there was this MIT paper showing that students who used large language models to write essays evidence lower cognitive activity than those who didn't, on the one hand. So knowing something about how the AI is affecting people in the first place. So it's not just the technical side, it's also the people
Yeah,
side of
sure.
things. The other example, so there was this study carried out so it would also have to do with how students perceive the use of AI, right? And one recent example of this in a paper carried out in China found that students overwhelmingly preferred to be graded by an AI versus by an instructor. And the reasons they gave for that is they thought it would be more fair if they were graded by an AI versus an instructor. And just
Yeah.
informally in the kind of talks I give and conversations I have with people, students in the United States or Europe don't like
Yeah,
that
they're
idea.
aghast. Yeah,
They
yeah,
couldn't
sure, yeah.
believe that something like that would happen. And so that would be
Yeah.
an example. And so there it's fairness, the notion of fairness is
Yeah.
central in both cases, but the way it's perceived and the social and cultural conditions surrounding it are much different. And I think it's important to know about those things.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Because I was going to ask, look, we think that bias and discrimination is bad. Don't create bias or discriminatory AI. Don't violate people's privacy. And so that seems like what that seems. I mean, it's not really clear cut, but what does that amount to? And your point is, different cultures are going to have different interpretations of what constitutes a violation of privacy or what constitutes fair or unfair circumstances, et cetera.
Good, yeah. And so that's a first layer of it. So how we cash out notions like harm, how we understand things like fairness, that's going to differ across cultures. And I'm not just
Yeah.
making that up. There's lots and lots of psychological and sociological and anthropological research right now showing that people think about those things differently. The second thing would be the fact that AI ethics policies and initiatives today, they tend to emphasize certain values, certain types of principles to the exclusions of other ones. And that emphasis itself is highly culturally dependent. So just to go into it a little bit, yeah, the notion of transparency, right? So transparency, one would think that must be a central, all-encompassing, super important AI ethical principle, right? Given
Okay.
how often people talk about it. The
Yeah,
notion,
sure, yeah.
sure, and the notion of transparency, though, is, and as philosophers, we might not take this for granted, or historians of culture, things like this, but the notion of transparency and its importance in AI is so centrally tied to notions of autonomy and decision making and things like this, and how important
Yeah.
that is to a group of people.
Yeah.
Another one would be, so more recently, UNESCO released a series of AI ethical guidelines, and it's based on a kind of rights-based framework. So it's all about protecting rights. And they have an addendum at the end that says something like, of course, also we should orient this in terms of different cultural groups and be sensitive to cultures and things like this. But a rights-based framework is itself based on a certain moral and cultural psychology that
Right.
emphasizes intentions.
Individual rights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
individual rights and intention in ethical decision making. So saying it's really important that to know whether something good or bad happened or whether you did something right or wrong, your intentions are super important. And that's based
Yeah.
on an individual and what an individual
Yeah.
does, individual rights and stuff like this. It's not based on outcomes based reasoning. And research has found that non-Western participants care a lot more about outcomes in ethical decision making and deciding
Oh,
whether
that's
things are
interesting.
right. Yeah, it's super interesting. So I'm happy to share that paper. Also,
Is that what, like people in China or Japan are going to think more about outcomes than individual rights? Is that the claim?
that's exactly what it is. The article that I have in mind, which again I'm happy to share, they had sample populations, I believe, in China and Singapore, but
Yeah.
so that's one. The other one is they found more broadly this finding amongst smaller scale societies. So smaller scale societies care much more about outcomes than intentions and ethical decision making. And so things like this, I think, are incredibly important. To get back to the main point,
Yeah.
rights-based frameworks and rights-based frameworks and fairness-based frameworks, they're built on these assumptions about what it is to be a person that we tend to take for granted that global populations might not share.
Okay, so Suppose I say something like this. Yes, there's different baseline assumptions you might make about ethics, whether it's primarily, if you like, oriented around the individual, the welfare and the flourishing of the individual, the rights of the individual, blah, blah, blah. Or rather, instead, it's primarily is or ought to be centered around the welfare of the flourishing of the rights of the community, the groups, right, society as a whole, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. There's some degree of tension there. Of course, it's a matter of degree. It's not binary, right? So it's not like people in the West don't care about outcomes and people on the East don't care about intentions or principles or anything like that. So it's a matter of emphasis, not either or, probably. And then I say, all right, so suppose that OpenAI or Google or Anthropic, whatever, they all happen to take a sort of more Western assumptions. Yeah, Western-centric assumptions. Okay, I take it that in my individual, I live in the West, I'm going to, let's assume that I have more Western-centric than I do Eastern-centric ethical views. I'm okay with that. I don't have any problem. I don't think I need to switch to their views any more than they necessarily think that I need to switch to their views. They might think, let 1,000 centric flowers bloom or whatever. And so I say, all right, so I'm a policymaker. I'm in the West. I'm creating policy for how the AI is going to be used within my jurisdiction, the West. So, yeah, it's going to be built for more Western-centric audiences, but so what? Is that necessarily a bad thing? Yeah, what's the problem?
Good. That's an open question. It's good.
Okay.
So that's good. I think that's an open question. And some people would say, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. But then I think you go down the slippery slope of, I talked to a friend who does policy work on the internet up in DC and digital democracy and stuff like this. Let me back up a little bit and say that perspective itself is Western-centric. So the idea that each and every person should be able to choose what's good for themselves and what they want, right? So this classically liberal Lockean or Hobbesian, we each pursue whatever we want.
Big emphasis on autonomy. Yeah.
Totally. So that's, and I remember just concrete examples of this. So if you remember a few years back when I think it was Google where they flagged Sharia as being an offensive word. And so you might say something like, oh, we're just catering to Western populations. But I don't think that's a claim these companies are making. So they're not saying that we're just concerned with wherever we have dominant market share or whatever, or where our company is based or where most of our users are. I don't think that's what they're saying.
I think that's right, yeah.
And so then if you want to go a little bit further and say, in that case, we're going to have different regimes of laws and things like this for different places, then you quickly fall into the problem of a splinter net or something like that. So it's here in the United States, we advocate for a kind of open internet digital ecosystem. But in China or Singapore, they do things differently. And I think that is one option. I think that's one option, but then there are problems with that. I don't think, though, that most companies think that they're doing that. So I think, the UNESCO guidelines, I think, are a good example of that because and again, I'm happy to share it, but in this report that comes out, they have this kind of, it's a circle and then all these parts or slices of the pie are supposed to be different concerns within AI and ethics, and as part of it, they have culture, and culture is next to education, it's next to healthcare, and it's next to well-being, but I guess that our claim would be that culture is so foundational to how we think about education, how we think about welfare, how we think of anything else, that it can't just be an add-on. We have to think and start with that more fundamentally.
So a couple things. One, we started sliding less into talk about what policy people they need to take into account and more what the companies who are building the models need to take into account. I guess two questions. One is, so what is a policy person to do? Let's grant, for the sake of argument, the plausible claim. Culture is not just one of these things that we take into consideration along a bunch of other things. It's actually the foundational lens through which we see the other things, education, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so culture is super important. I'm a policymaker. Let's say I'm in either the US or I'm in the EU or in Canada, Mexico, whatever. So I'm in the West. Okay, so what does it look like for me to pass policy being insufficiently sensitive to that? Let's just start there.
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so that's already what's going on. So that's already what's going on insofar as the policy isn't making use of or considering empirical results or methodologies whatsoever. And so that I think would be problematic. And so a first step would be just, what do we know so far about how people think about these types of things. My own background in research is in engineering and technology ethics and global engineering and technology ethics. And I worked and taught for 8 years in China, in Shanghai, China. And I was responsible for teaching engineering ethics to Chinese engineering students. And a lot of this work is an outgrowth of that earlier work that I've been engaged in
Yeah.
for the last 10 years or so. And being in that position, there are two things we know, right? Is teaching people about ethics doesn't make anyone more ethical. Just
Sure, for
knowing
sure.
something about ethics, that's the first thing. The
Yeah.
second thing is that, how we think about right and wrong and good and bad and what should and shouldn't be done. There's a strong cultural dimension to it. And philosophers historically, or even policymakers, don't have a lot to say about that, or they don't have
Yeah.
a way of addressing that. Whereas moral psychologists and cultural anthropologists and sociologists, people who study these things, how people behave, why they behave the way they do, how
Yeah.
culture makes these differences, they do.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a matter of going out there and seeing. And so just here's a concrete takeaway from our own work in teaching ethics to Chinese engineering students, right? Because we want to ensure that all engineers, wherever they come from, have a kind of minimal ethical standard. And that's part of the objective of this class that
Yeah.
I taught, is that students have an understanding of professional ethical responsibility.
Yeah.
We want everyone to get here, but people come at that from very different perspectives potentially, but we need to know how different those perspectives are, right? And a lot of my work up until this point has explored that and looking at exactly what those similarities and differences are. So one example of that was amongst Chinese engineering students. When they thought about ethical issues in engineering, they thought much more about issues of fairness and justice and things like this. So work sharing, being honest with people, things like this, versus the kind of harm that could result from their work. And so in a case like that, then I think in a curricula, or curriculum, you would want to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things for this certain group to make sure everyone gets here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm trying to figure out. So look, here's an easy claim. It would be good if policymakers were familiar with cultural differences, differences in values across populations, blah, blah, blah. It'd be nice for them to know. Easy. Second claim, which is, I think, the one that you're driving at, which I don't totally, yes, in the abstract sounds right, but I don't, it's not concrete enough.
It's a lot of work.
No, forget about it's a lot of work. It's just, okay, what do I need? What does a better policy look like? Can you give me an example of, or the outline of a policy as regards, here's how you ought to treat your AI. So I'm a policy person. I'm creating EU AI Act, whatever we're on, V3, V4 at this point, or I'm creating federal regulation for the US, and I need to create this policy. And what would a good policy look like that is sensitive to the cultural differences that you're speaking of?
Okay.
That wouldn't show up if I weren't sensitive in that sort of way. So I don't want it just to be like, oh, I'm going to pass either policy 1 or policy 2, and actually they're identical. It's just that when I pass the second one, I'm really sensitive to different cultures, and then when I pass policy 1, I'm not, but it's functionally equivalent. That knowledge of the differences doesn't show up in my work. So how does knowledge of the differences show up specifically in my work as a policymaker?
Good. And I guess, and again, maybe going a little bit further back here, so you had mentioned moving from policy to what the company should do and I think that, and not just I think, you see so much of the policy being crafted by the people who are involved in the companies and vice versa. Like policymakers want people who are technically proficient involved in the policymaking itself. And so I think that really depends on individual use cases, right? So how the technology is being used, and then what we take away from the technology being used in a good or a bad way based on what we learn from that. So a concrete example of that would be something I would think a concrete example of something along those lines would be different student populations are going to be more and less okay with, that would a concrete, simple example of AI being used to grade their work or not. And I don't think that it's just, oh, this population wants this thing and is okay with this thing, therefore we should do it. Not at all.
Yeah.
But certainly in thinking about what types of policies to craft, we should take that into account in the decision making. I guess another one, not culturally related, but more broadly, if we know that using AI to write essays decreases students' mental capacities, and part of what learning should be is increasing mental capacities, then we
Hmm.
shouldn't allow it to be used in those contexts. You know what I'm saying? And so it's I think, an open question.
Okay, so first of all, I think one thing that I was hearing when you said policy is things like regulation, but you actually, I think you mean more
Um,
specifically policies within a given organization, like
we would say, yeah,
a company.
I would say,
Okay.
yeah, and
Okay.
policies understood incredibly broadly to refer to
Okay.
things like, yeah, I would say AI and responsible AI ethics initiatives
Yeah.
more broadly. And so
Yeah.
that could
Yeah. Yeah.
be, yeah,
Okay. So here's another way of putting it. Let me see, tell me if I have it right. It's something like you're a multinational organization. Maybe you're based in the US or whatever, but you operate in hundreds of markets, several continents. And what you have is an enterprise wide AI ethics policy.
yes,
And because it's an enterprise wide AI ethics policy that's meant to tell everyone everywhere within the organization here's what's allowed and here's what's not allowed, roughly, or here's how to build your AI and here's how not to build your AI. It's necessarily coarse grained because it applies to everyone.
yes.
And what we need is more fine grained policy directives because it's just going to land totally differently in Japan versus the UK or something.
Yeah, or I would say, in the best possible world, we begin with something like lowest common denominator ethical principles or something like that, right? Things that
Mm-hmm.
everyone can agree. So just a lot of our own work uses the framework of moral foundations theory, and it's a relatively older work from Jonathan Haidt. Like, empirically, there are problems with it, but there's this idea that ethics is about at least five different things, right? So it's not just about one thing, it's about a whole bunch of different things.
Sure.
And depending on which
You're
culture
thinking
you,
of like human. I
yeah,
imagine you're thinking of things like individual or human well-being, the well-being of the community, probably
yeah.
rights.
So the idea is that basically, yeah, the idea is that, so one, ethical judgments are most primarily the result of intuitions rather than the application
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
principles, right? So that's one thing. And then
Okay.
the second thing is that these intuitions have evolved culturally,
Sure.
biologically, and historically. And so it's at least caring for people is good, harming people is bad, being fair is good,
Mm.
cheating is bad, being loyal is good, being disloyal is
Yeah.
bad, adhering to authority is good, not adhering to authority is bad, and keeping oneself
Yeah.
sanctified is good, and not sanctified is bad, or degrading oneself in some way. And so one of the things they found, and again, we use this in a lot of our work with engineering populations across different cultures, so primarily Asia, Europe, and the United States. And one of the things we found, which is also what more of Jonathan Haidt and colleagues have found, is that across all groups, they care about care and fairness, and then to a
Yeah.
lesser extent about those other kinds of types of issues. And so one of the takeaways for that would be that in all cases, we emphasize things like care and fairness, and then we show how that applies to engineering and
Yeah.
technology situations specifically on the one hand,
Yeah.
and then also trying to identify when those other foundations might come into
Yeah.
conflict.
So let me try to put this slightly differently. Okay, look, we have these organizations, these companies. They're going to create policies or instructions for how their people should or should not develop and or use AI. It's going to be used in all sorts of places. One of the things that we have to understand is that in giving those instructions, if we're not sensitive to the cultural context in which the AI is being deployed, we're going to make up stupid,
Yes.
potentially disrespectful rules. And so there needs to be a kind of, I don't know if it's a meta rule, but it's something like a rule to, as you're developing and or using AI, to
Culture
pay
into
careful
account.
attention to the
Yeah.
cultures in which you're deploying it, which in turn requires the data scientists or whoever's working on the AI to have some degree of
Yes.
understanding of the cultural complexities, because assuming that they're going to do something on, if you like, the AI ethics, responsible AI front, then they can't do it well unless they're sufficiently sensitive to what this culture thinks about fairness versus what that culture thinks about fairness, and so on and so forth.
That would be the claim. And so, even again, maybe to back up a little bit, is when I talk about policies, initiatives, that would be also, or it would concern things within organizations like continuing education, right? And so The idea that within organizations you have embedded ethicists. Global companies, they hire more anthropologists, sociologists, people who do
Yeah.
have background in these types of things, and that those people would be involved in conversations like this also, which again, I think is a lot of work, and it's different from what it used to be, but companies are more international and global and multinational than they've ever been before. And you see these problems, I think, more and more, and you'll continue to see them more and more.
So do you think then the solution is, I mean, I think this is what you were saying, but tell me if I'm wrong. The solution is that we need to give a kind of like humanities, social sciences education to data scientists?
Yeah, I
As
would. Yeah, and again,
in an ideal world.
yeah, in an ideal world, and I'm taking a programming course this semester just because as an employee at Virginia Tech, we can take additional classes and programming and data science classes and stuff like this, so I can, as a philosopher and as
Yeah.
a social science guy, so I can talk better with them. And yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of assumptions in a basic programming course. We have this, the final example was, so we were using learning computer or graphic user interfaces, and we're learning the turtle program, which is you program a little turtle to race around the screen or whatever.
Yeah.
And just the professor had pointed out to us where, so the turtles are doing their race, and this program itself was based on a loop that iterated, and such that the turtle that ostensibly won or appeared to win might not have actually won because there was a lag in when data was being processed or whatever. But
Okay.
that's a very concrete example of thinking about the consequences of programming and getting data scientists and computer scientists honed in on that in a way that they might not be otherwise. So if you're not cognizant of the fact that what you see on the screen is in fact what's not going on, and as a result of this, it can be unfair. You announce the wrong winner or something like that. It's not just a technical issue, it's an ethical issue.
Yeah. I want to double click on that a little bit. Okay, I get that if these people aren't sufficiently trained, they might come up with things that are not tailored to a culture in which they're deploying the AI. Can you tell me sort of something like, what's the bad stuff that happens? I can imagine people thinking, oh, I'm interacting with this large language model, for instance, and I don't know, it seems to be prioritizing individual autonomy more than community welfare, and that's annoying to me. I've had to prompt the AI to say, hey, stop being so Western-centric or stop prioritizing autonomy over community well-being, and there have to be a trade-off. So I can see people being annoyed, maybe offended. Anything worse than that? Nothing's going to work perfectly for everyone. Everyone's going to be offended by something. We do the best we can, so it works for as many people as well as possible. But at the end of the day, what's the real, I'm not sure if this is the right way to put it, what's the real harm here if we don't make things sufficiently culturally sensitive to all the different cultures, blah, blah?
Yeah, I think, and again, I think it really depends on the use case. So I guess just two things that quickly come to mind could be, especially as large language models and different AI technology. And I think a lot of what we're talking about here and the examples are large language models, right? And there's all kinds of other AI technologies that haven't caught on to the same extent that might. But using large language models, especially in the context of getting advice from them. And so I can imagine that would be something like, so using them as a therapy bot or something like that.
Sure, yeah.
And so depending on the cultural context that you're interacting with, you could have very different appropriate course of action in dealing with one's family and dealing with a spouse and whatnot. That would be more. I mean, also then.
No, that's interesting, right? Because if, at least I'm no anthropologist or sociologist, but from what I gather, there are certain cultures that are way more respectful of their elders than we are in the States, and so there's a way that the advice that you might, I can imagine a sort of an LLM that's acting as some kind of therapist or mentor or guide or whatever says, you just have to tell your parents what your needs are, and that you have to prioritize your welfare, and you've got to respect that as my parents. And then just that being completely the wrong kind of advice to give for a variety of reasons.
And again, I think working at a university, you're spending a lot of time living and working abroad, like how do you interact with colleagues or students from different cultures, right? There's some things like how you dress, how you joke around, like it's, in some cases there's, as an educator, there's a steep learning curve on stuff like that. So I can imagine that. Those are just two examples that come to mind. I guess the other example that I'm thinking of also that I kind of wanted to talk about, that I was thinking about in preparing for this, is that if we limit ourselves to Western and Westocentric values and principles and stuff like this, harm, fairness, whatnot, it limits our moral imagination, our moral worldviews. And so one example that I've been hearing about a lot is death bots, right? And so the idea
Death
that,
bots?
yeah, death bots. So I think that's what they're called. So it's a type of like digital twin. So let's say you pass away, they harvest all your data, all these interviews
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
done
yeah.
with people, yeah, and then they create a read, right? And in a lot of cases, you see the discourse surrounding this being framed in terms of like, you're either harming the people who are using them, one, or two, there's something unfair about using using their likeness without their consent. And you also see
Sure.
conversations concerning actors and actresses. And
Yep, sure.
but I think that's not really the issue. I think what the issue is that we just think there's something creepy about it, right? We think that there's something
Sure.
creepy and wrong about it, and there's something that's undignified and it's degrading to interact with something like that. And that's that sanctity moral foundation that I had mentioned before from moral foundations. That's in part what that keys in on, is that there's something else aside from fairness or transparency or not harming others that we care about in our moral world. But if we focus exclusively on these kind of Westocentric concerns and notions and principles, we can't understand our world as well, I don't think, or what's wrong with using technologies, or maybe what's right about using technologies.
Suppose we're all convinced this all sounds good, and then I point out, look, we've been talking about Western-centric and Eastern-centric as though they're two sort of kinds of values or value foundations you might have. But in fact, I imagine Canadian culture is different from U.S. culture, is different from Japanese culture, is different from Chinese culture, is different from Vietnamese culture, is different. There's at least, at a bare minimum, I'm sure there's more because there's subcultures within a culture, but there's at least one culture per country, probably more cultures per country. Ethical. And so I wonder about how we're actually supposed to do this in practice. I think sometimes about when people talk about fair distribution of goods and services. And forget about the Eastern-Western thing. We just want a fair distribution of goods and services across subpopulations. Or people say something like, what we really need is representatives from the different groups to be part of the development of AI. And then I think, what are you going to do? You're going to have a middle-aged white person, a young Vietnamese man, an older Cambodian woman. Just keep going. There's countless numbers of people that could be representative of different cultures. You literally can't have them all on your team. Logistically, financially, it's just an obvious pragmatic impossibility. And so I say, yeah, look, it'd be great, it'd be good, we should be culturally sensitive, yada, yada, but there's too many different kinds of cultures, there's too many different kinds of subcultures. How are we supposed to, if you like, choose which ones we're going to make sure we're really respectful of and which ones, well, it's close enough to Japan or whatever? How do we engage in this?
I think that's an excellent question. So I guess a couple things. So the first thing is, I think, and the evidence is that culture is an incredibly local, fine-grained type of thing. So I think you're right about it. So there is no American culture. There are American cultures. There is no Chinese culture. There are 56 different ethnicities in China. They're Chinese cultures, right?
Yes,
and they're, again, to take it back to our previous work on global engineering and technology ethics, there's not one engineering culture. There's cultures of environmental engineering are like very different than petroleum engineering. And there's all this. So that's one thing. So it's undoubtedly the case that culture is a fine-grained thing. The question then, I think, is what's shared across different types of cultures. So how different cultures are, and that's an empirical question. And so I think there are good reasons for thinking there are certain things that are shared across all cultures, and we ought to be responsive and take into account all of those things.
But I wonder how much having your child murdered, okay, that's going to be cross-cultural, I'm sure. I'm reasonably confident. But to your point, while we all might sign up for fairness and caring and sovereignty of the self, in practice, those look like wildly different things. This is just the point that you made earlier. I suppose it is an empirical question. How much, if you like, meat on the bones is there on that universal agreement? If it's really nasty stuff, indiscriminate killing, okay, fine. Yeah, we'll get lots of universality or lots of shared cultures, things that we share within a culture or across cultures, rather. But if it's as broad as we're for fairness and for caring and for sovereignty of the self and blah, 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 then I don't know how much agreement we get because we have wildly different interpretations of all those things. And so we're back to where we started from. Oh shit, there's not enough universality other than the really nasty stuff. So is that where we should start then, with what's the really nasty stuff that everybody really hates?
Maybe. I think we need to start by investigating, and we need more information. And so as a researcher, of course, that's what I think. Just a really concrete example from science, technology, and society studies or communication studies with huge ramifications. And it has to do with how scientists versus politicians think about and communicate risk, right? So politicians, the worst thing you can do is make a type 2 error. So think that something is the case when it's not the case. So this dam might collapse. The worst thing in the world would be to say, oh, it's not going to collapse, and then it collapses. Yeah. Scientists, by contrast, and this has to do with long periods of education and scientific practices, data sharing, checking your results, peer review, whatnot. Scientists, the worst thing they can do is make a type 1 error and say that something is the case that isn't the case, and then have to issue a retraction. So scientists would much rather keep their mouth shut until they know something is the case, whereas politicians, by contrast, and that results in all kinds of, historically, it's resulted in all kinds of conflicts where politicians are thinking about risk in a very different way. I guess that would be another concrete example of finding out and so in that case, it doesn't have to do with national cultures or regional cultures. It has to do with, I guess you could say, professional cultures or something like this. Yeah. It's that there's this difference that you might not expect to be the case, that is the case, that's incredibly consequential. And so it's a matter of, and part of that then is just knowing that when scientists talk about things, they think and talk about it in a certain way. Yeah. Whereas politicians think and talk about it in a different way. There's that funny scene from Don't Look Up. I don't know if you saw that movie or listening.
I did, but I don't remember it that well.
There's this funny scene where, so Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he's an astronomer, and they know that the comet is coming towards Earth, and he says, it's 99.9% sure that it's going to hit. Mm-hmm. And then later, the politicians come back and they say, you told us it was 100%, but it isn't. And he said, it's 99.9%. And they're like, where's... And so maybe it's not a funny example because so much climate science stuff it's supposed to be a metaphor for climate science. But that would be another example of why I think it's really important to understand how culture and moral psychology and how people think about issues of right and wrong.
Here's where I take it where things stand. You say, look, we got to pay attention to different people's cultures in developing this AI stuff. Yep. Okay. I'm going to assume for the sake of argument that we're not talking about cultures that we find morally abhorrent. Sure. You don't have to go around respecting them and developing AI for the morally abhorrent ones. Okay. And we can have big disputes about what are the morally abhorrent cultures, what are morally acceptable, and that's just a separate issue that's difficult to solve and settle. But okay, put that stuff to the side. And then I say, yeah, but Rocky, there's too many cultures. You want to go around developing AI and educating engineers on different cultures so that they can develop these cultures. But aren't there just too many cultures? There's countless cultures, subcultures, and subcultures within subcultures. Sure. And then I take it, so we need to do something. And then your response is, what we should do is, methodologically, we should start with trying to figure out what are the commonalities across those cultures. Yeah. And I say, is that going to be meaty enough? Is there enough agreement? Really on the ground, is there agreement? Not just high-level principle stuff, but really on the ground, in the weeds, if you like, agreement? And I take it your answer is, I don't know, but we should look.
I don't know.
But we should look, but it's worth looking.
We might be surprised by what we find, right? Because it could be a small difference might end up having huge effects, and it's worthwhile to investigate that, whereas other stuff we might not care about as much. But that's the general principle, and I guess the last thing is, I don't think that we should rely on our own intuitions alone regarding how people think about issues of right and wrong, how they think about how technology shouldn't be used. We shouldn't take it for granted that our ethical intuitions, our intuitions about technology are shared across different groups. And that there's that book, I think it's called An Ugly Truth, those journalists who followed Facebook for a while. One of their kind of conclusions about Facebook and the culture, and then they tracked it from the time, especially that Sheryl Sandberg got on board and they started monetizing Facebook and whatnot through ads. One of the kind of simple takeaways of Facebook was that they were just too optimistic. So it's the people who are involved at Facebook are just, for the most part, they tend to be middle upper class, privileged. And so a journalist had asked this question, like, what are you going to do when someone kills someone else on the live stream? And they're like, oh, why would someone do that? And like, sure enough, it happens. And it's,
Yeah. It's another way of saying something like, we're really bad both at empathy with people who are very much different from us, and engaging in a sort of moral imaginative exercise of what's in their head, how they're thinking about things, how they see the world, what they're willing to do, what they're unwilling to do. We're just bad at it, which isn't surprising. We should be bad at it. That's what you would expect, because it's not your world. So you can't intuit your way. You can't just feel your way to empirical facts about what other complex cultures are like.
Good. And insofar as we're social and cultural creatures, we're especially attuned to our own cultures, whereas we don't really need to care at all about other cultures. Historically as we've evolved.
Yeah. Rocky, go do the research and let me know what you find out.
Okay. Thanks so much for having me on today, Reed.
That was my pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wasilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.